Good afternoon from Los Angeles, California. I'm Dr. Ryan Ava. Clashes between protesters and security forces across Iran continue nearly a month after the death of Mahsa Amini. The 22-year-old died in police custody on September 16th after she was detained in Tehran and by the country's morality police for allegedly inappropriate attire. Authorities are waging deadly crackdown amid the 4 weeks of protests, making one of the boldest challenges to the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. With reports of strikes now spreading to the nation's vital energy sector, the Norway-based nonprofit Iran Human Rights says at least 185 people, including 19 minors, have been killed and hundreds have been injured. The government reports 20 members of its own security forces have been killed.
Senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Karim Sajapur. He focuses on Iran and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. Also with us, White House editor for Politico, Sam Stein, back with us as well. So good to have you on the show this morning, Karim. I guess what do you make of these latest protests? At first, analysts said, well, these protests exist, but it won't make a mark. Do we still feel that way?
No, Mika, I think this is now the most serious threat that the Iranian regime has faced since 1979. There's something that feels inexorable about what these, especially these young girls in Iran want, which is reminiscent of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. They're not fighting racial apartheid, they're fighting gender apartheid. And they're the majority. You know, you have a regime which is led by very old men and a society which is young and modern and wants change. So the only toolkit the regime has is repression. That has worked for them in the past. They can repress street protests, but when you start to see strikes among oil workers, among merchants in Iran, and then you see the scope of these protests expand on a national level, it's much more difficult to contain.
And Joe, the parallel with 1979, what's different? One thing that's different is technology. And these young people, they've gotten a sense of what life could look like without repression in their lives.
What's also different is in 1979, you obviously had leaders running that revolution. You had Khomeini in Paris. He was the figure that they rallied behind. This is just organic.
Yeah.
It's middle school girls that are rising up against leaders. It's women, it's men, it's everybody. I would love for you to explain. You sent out a post yesterday that showed how Iranian troops had no problem gunning down people in the street, just shooting dead in the street. And you said, there's a Persian expression for that, it's like drinking water. Explain.
In Persian, we say misla ab khordan, when something comes so effortlessly to someone, it's just like they're drinking water. And you see the nonchalance with which these security forces in Iran were just shooting people as if they were going out for an afternoon stroll. And the supreme leader in Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is probably the longest-serving dictator in the world. He's been in power since 1989. And it's what I call the Khamenei doctrine. He believes that when your population is rising up, you should never back down. You should never take a step back, because that's not going to pacify demonstrators.
Sounds like what the Shah was thinking in 79.
Well, in fact, because Ayatollah Khamenei himself was a revolutionary, that was one of his key takeaways, that you never back down. And then he saw what happened with Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. He believes that the Soviet Union collapsed because Gorbachev tried to reform it. He's seen the Arab uprisings. The only dictator who's still around is Bashar Assad, Iran's client in Syria. Why? Because he didn't apologize. He crushed the protesters. So that's the only playbook he has.
You know, I'd love for you to explain something to our viewers who may not be well versed on Persian culture, Persian history. I remember after getting to Congress, talking to generals who at the time, whenever they talk about Iran, would tell me, to a general would say, what would be the most dramatic change in the world, the biggest impact in the world? They'd say, if we could turn Iran. And they would all talk about what an extraordinary culture it is. They loved the Iranians. Yeah. He said, we worked with these people, we trained with these people. They believed that it was an extraordinary culture with an extraordinary history, and they couldn't come to terms with the fact that a barbaric, tyrannical theocracy had seized control of this great civilization.
You're absolutely right, Joe. This is a 2,500-year-old civilization. National Geographic magazine called the Persian Empire the world's greatest historic superpower. And the last 43 years have been an aberration in Iran, where you have a regime which has come to power whose identity is premised on three things: death to America, death to Israel, and the compulsory veiling of women, which is it's so unnatural for people. So I think that if this regime falls, which is still a big if, but I believe it would be one of the most geopolitically significant political implosions since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the results would be felt in Ukraine, where Iran is now sending drones to Russia. It would be felt in Venezuela, where Iran is keeping in power the Maduro regime. And it would be felt very profoundly in the Middle East, where Iran is to much of the Middle East what Putin is to Europe.
I have two questions for you. One is, how is this different fundamentally, not than the 70s, but then 2009, 2010, during the Green Revolution, where we were sitting around having a very similar conversation, how technology was opening up the Iranian culture. You had Twitter just in its infancy then, but people were tweeting protests. Suddenly, Iranians could communicate with the world and broadcast what was happening in the streets there. Of course, it ended the way it ended. The second question is, looming over all this are the nuclear negotiations. The initial promise of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal was essentially, you let us have access to your nuclear technology, you forego nuclear weapons, and we integrate you into Western civilization over time, more or less simplistic. But now they're trying to re-enter these negotiations. So how do these protests affect those talks? And how did the ending of that nuclear deal affect these protests?
Those are two important questions. So on the first, what is, I think, somewhat unique about this Iranian regime, even by the standards of dictatorships, is it's not only politically authoritarian, but it's also economically and socially authoritarian. They police every aspect of your life. So we're going to deprive you of political freedoms. You're going to run the economy to the ground, but you also can't, if you're a woman, you can't dress how you want. You can't go out with your boyfriend or girlfriend. Right. You can't drink alcohol. There's no social release for people. And so these protests were triggered by a social grievance, which is the killing of this young woman, Mahsa Amini, for improper hijab. But the grievances are widespread. They're economic, political, and social. And as you guys both alluded to, there's now 50 million smartphones in Iran, so everyone is a citizen journalist. So that's one thing. When it comes to U.S. policy toward Iran, up until now, for the last 16, 17 months, really the sole U.S. strategy toward Iran has been to revive the 2015 nuclear agreement, which Barack Obama signed and Donald Trump exited in 2018. I now think we have to rethink that approach. Iran is not just a nuclear challenge. It's obviously also a regional challenge, but similar to what Ronald Reagan did during the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. He negotiated with them. At the same time, he denounced them as an evil empire. He implored Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And I think now, if the Iranian regime gets desperate enough and they come to us and say, that nuclear deal you offered us 2 months ago, we think we'll take it now. I think the United States should put these negotiations on ice. Because if we were to do a deal now with this regime, it would actually be meddling inside Iran in order to empower the regime against the protesters.
Well,
so
that's a great point.
The first deal empowered the regime.
Right.
I understand. I understand the thought behind it, but I don't know how we can do that now. Really, couldn't see how we could do it before. They've been the epicenter of terror since 1979. And I'm not idealistic. Anybody that's been watching today said we've got to figure out how to work with China. We've got to figure out a way to work with the Saudis. But in this case, just going back and doing a nuclear deal, does the administration really want to do this?
My sense is there's an internal divide. I think people at the White House understand the importance of this moment. I think for President Biden, it would not reflect well politically to all of a sudden unleash billions of dollars to a regime which is crushing the spirits of its young society, and they're not going to change their ideology. But I think still at the State Department, you have folks who are still committed to the policy of before.
Senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Karim Sajapur, thank you very much for your insights this morning.
To support my work, please click the subscribe, the like button, and the notification bell so you wouldn't miss any of my new videos.